Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. I'm Tammy Lytle, a freelance reporter and past president of the National Press Club. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual headliners book and author talk with Elizabeth McGowan, a National Press Club member and the author of Outpedaling the Big C, My Healing Cycle Across America. We'll get started in a moment, but just a reminder that we are happy to accept your questions and will ask as many as time allows. To submit a question, please email headliners@press.org. As the COVID-19 pandemic pushed us out of malls and movie theaters and restaurants, many of us found a respite in nature. Bike rides and trail hikes in our local green spaces and the national parks. Indeed, one study published late last year in the Journal of Forestry Research found significant increases in usage worldwide during the pandemic's first wave. Nature may indeed be soothing for the soul, and boy, can we use that this year. Today, we highlight one of our own special National Press Club members, Pulitzer Prize winner Elizabeth McGowan. Elizabeth has written a moving memoir about her 90-day solo bike ride from Oregon to Virginia, undertaken during her recovery from melanoma. That's the same disease that killed her father at age 44 when Elizabeth was just a teenager. Elizabeth chronicles her 4,000 plus mile journey in an insightful and touching memoir called Outpedaling the Big C, My Healing Cycle Across America. She sets out to raise money for cancer research, but along the way finds a better understanding of herself and of her late father, and some life lessons that may be a balm for many of us during these difficult times. This month also marks both National Bike Month and National Melanoma Awareness Month, so we are especially glad to converse with Elizabeth, now a freelance journalist covering energy and the environment. As a staff writer for Inside Climate News, she had won the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting with colleagues David Hassemeyer and Lisa Song for their series on the Kalamazoo oil spill. Elizabeth, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, I'm absolutely delighted to be here.
That's great. So, spoiler alert, I can tell you something about how the book ends because Elizabeth is here with us today, having survived not only the physical strain of her trip, but the emotional and medical challenges of surviving cancer repeatedly. Along the way, she raised money for the Wisconsin hospital where she was treated, talked with many people about melanoma, and even passed out coupons for sunscreen. So I'm going to start out Jeopardy style with an answer in the form of an excerpt from the book, then a question, then we will hear our first live answer from Elizabeth. In the introduction, you wrote, "Why would an ordinary recreational cyclist bother to devote an extraordinary effort to engaging in daily conversations about this disease? As corny as it might sound, I believe that most people want to be part of a greater good. Sometimes you have to be the one who holds the door ajar." Deep down, we all know that nobody gets out of here alive, but I think most of us have the urge to make our stay, however brief, somewhat memorable. Elizabeth, the first question is, what possessed you to dedicate the time, money, and emotional energy to make this trip?
Okay, well, like one of my friends said, Elizabeth, you couldn't have just thrown a party. That would have been un-Elizabeth-like. So, right. So maybe I have a little obsession with going end to end, as I did hike the whole length of the Appalachian Trail when I had a respite from my treatments. But I got the idea because I was 5 years cancer-free. This hospital had played a significant role in getting me through chemotherapies, immunotherapies, and many surgeries. And I thought, I need to do something. And I was just itching to do something big. So I selected this cross-country ride. I pedaled up to the hospital, presented that idea. They were in. They had a graphic artist who created a map. I was like a little blue or red dot on the map, and they would move me across as I pedaled across the country. But I'm telling you, getting out from Wisconsin to Oregon, you go to the Pacific coast, going through those landscapes that I was going to be pedaling back through, whoa, I thought, Elizabeth, what have you bitten off? And I've traveled, I had camped a lot, but I was thinking, why didn't I just tell that hospital I would ride my bike around the state of Wisconsin, 2 ways and call it a day?
I can read a little bit more from your book about your sort of philosophical thoughts about your motivations. You say in chapter 23, early on, I had wrestled with my own motives for my ride. I had made my reasons clear, but I actually wondered if subconsciously other drivers lurked beneath the superficial ones. What really motivates any of us to act on what we think of as a beneficial undertaking? Did I think that if I did this good thing, it would insulate me from being punished with more cancer? Had I convinced myself that I would be swaddled in a good karma bubble if I deposited more positives into the universe than I borrowed? And you go on to write, I was motivated by doing instead of just hoping. Maybe I figured physical feats was like a vaccine for cancer. After all, how could a disease kill me if it couldn't quite catch up with me? Have you thought any more now that you have 20 years perspective looking back on that trip about why you did it? It's
Well, I
different.
think I think that's why I write for a living. That summarizes it very well. And I didn't want it to be all about Elizabeth. I wanted it to be an outreach trip. That's why I was carrying two panniers and a small bag in the front. And one of the panniers was like a third of the way filled with brochures that I handed out. The other, I mean, I was camping on this trip. The other decision I made was not to carry a stove, a camp stove, because I'd have to go into restaurants and that way I would have to have interactions with people. So it was really about trying to make a connection with people. And that mattered to me, especially at that juncture, is talking about a word like cancer that, 20, 30 years ago when my dad was undergoing it, we didn't even say the word. It was a word that people avoided because it was scary, like it was catchable. So I think that what I was trying to do, maybe it was too much to bite off, but I wanted time to process and I wanted to make a connection. And if I had skipped this, I would have forever punished myself in some way for not doing it when the time was right.
What impact do you think the ride had beyond the $15,000 or so you raised for the hospital that's now known as Pro Health Waukesha Memorial Hospital? And for those of you from the GoFundMe era, I'd like to point out that $15,000 actually was a lot of money to raise in an era before the whole world was conducting their lives online. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I kind of had turned my whole living room into a post office before I left on the trip and let people know I was doing this. And but the impact I think I had was, I mean, the I was keeping journals along the way, right? And I also did not have a laptop, nor did I have a cell phone. So I would stop at libraries along the route and I kept a paper journal and I would write out these electronic journal entries, send them into the hospital, and they would post them with that little map where here I was, the little dot moving across the country. And that that resonated with people. I had no idea if this thing was going to fall flat or if it would take on a life of its own. And I like to think that it did the latter because after I did this ride, which was the year 2000 and all the postings, they called me, said, Elizabeth, in 2001, we're going to post all of this again. People loved following this so much. We're going to put it up on the website again. And I know it inspired other people to ride their bike and try to raise money too. So I think I sent Christmas cards, holiday cards, whatever, at the end of my ride to everybody I made contact with along the way. And I mean, all the money went to the hospital. Somebody handed me $5 on the ride. I mailed it to the hospital and I had all these addresses and I thanked everybody at the end. So I like to think there was a little linear piece of America that was able to say, hooray, all at once, that they felt there was some kind of galvanizing going on.
That's great. So at the end of the book, you talk about how you were reminded that the trip was a piece of cake compared with surviving cancer. You say, no doubt my continental journey had its share of harrowing moments: sleet storms, serpentine climbs, truck slipstreams powerful enough to suck me off the road, and that jarring spill in Oregon were all part of the adventure. When I needed motivation, I reminded myself how hard I had worked to recover from chemotherapy treatments and surgeries. That combined with my ingrained hard headedness, I think your mom is probably watching and saying, yeah, hard headedness gave me the strength to persist. Some rainy or close to 100-degree days, it was tempting to load my bike onto a pickup truck, but that wasn't the purpose of my ride. It was about completing the entire journey, every stinking inch of it. Elizabeth, what was the lowest point of the trip and how did you get through it?
Well, the lowest point probably was very early on. I was in Monmouth, Oregon, which was a town that was kind of near and dear to my heart because my family had spent the summer back in the early 70s camping there. My father had gotten a National Science Foundation grant, so we spent the summer out there. And I was kind of excited to go back and see if I could recognize any landmarks. Well, I made the mistake of looking down at my map, and any of you cyclists know, don't take your eye off the road. I looked at the map, boom, I was over a curb. I felt like I was riding a bucking bronco. I was up in the air and I knew it wasn't going to go well, and I smashed to the ground. I looked around. Part of me was hoping nobody had seen this ridiculous little episode.
Dismount.
Yeah, exactly. And I heard a crack when I landed. So then part of me was hoping somebody did see me and would run over and say, how can we help you? What happened? Well, I kind of did one of those checks and I was able to get back on the bike. My arm, because my left arm was sore. And you have to use your left arm to shift your bicycle. So I found a way. I had my first aid kit was pretty tiny. I took some ibuprofen. I propped my arm back up and I kept going. I When I would stop in towns, people would give me ice. They'd look at me and say, "Oh, what?" I said, "Well, I've got a little situation, but I'm not going to stop. I am not going to stop this ride 200 or 300 miles in." So I just kept icing it, taking a little ibuprofen. And when I did finish the trip, I had to go in for physical therapy, but I was not going to let this arm be to keep me from getting to Virginia.
Let's talk about what you learned about the country and how the trip might be different now, 20 years later. You wrote, quote, "My journey across 4 time zones had revealed that we're not as Walmart-sized, Starbucks-sized, or homogenized as critics lament. It was reassuring and comforting that pockets of this country still retained their distinct cuisine, cultural customs, and defining speech patterns." A lot of your trip was about talking with strangers and urging them to be on the lookout for melanoma. Would that be different today in an era of polarization in our country, do you think?
Well, I I'm not I'm not sure. I mean, I was trying to, I wasn't running a campaign. I was just trying to do outreach. And I was this route, this 4,250-mile route, the Transamerica route, uh, it's really blue highways. And in this case, blue does not mean political leaning. It means when we look at old fashioned maps and it's those itty bitty roads. So you're not riding on interstates, you're on secondary, tertiary roads, and you're going through little towns. And that's part of the appeal, is that people are accessible. You go into town,
Mm.
there might be one restaurant, there might be two to choose from. So it was a matter of having the conversations. And I'm not really a church going person, but I spent time camping in church yards because they had great green spaces. I would often befriend that. I would just knock on the door of the church. Oh, sure, you can stay there. Or, I mean, one time when I was on this near the Snake River on the Idaho-Oregon border, there was no green space. The town was just this narrow linear path. So I knocked on a man's door and he let me stay in his front yard.
Mhm.
And not only that, but he brought me tomatoes from his garden. So there were so many opportunities to make a connection. And I guess I could have, put my blinders on and said, oh, I hope I only will talk to 2 people here. But I thought, if I'm out here, yes, it's takes extra energy after you've ridden, 70 or 80 miles a
Yeah.
day. But the point was to do that. So, like I said, not carrying the stove, eating. And I'm telling you, the bicycle is a great ambassador. It wasn't just me. Here I am, a 39-year-old woman, not very intimidating looking, and the bike led the way for me. Oh, people would see those panniers on the back. where are you headed? What are you doing? And it was instant rapport. And I could have talked with anybody about this. I wasn't seeking out anybody in particular. And I'm telling you also, most everybody has a cancer story, whether it's them, their relatives, everybody has a cancer story. And if you make yourself vulnerable by talking about this, people open up. And I mean, I would have people gathered around a booth at a restaurant, showing me their scars. Look under here, Elizabeth. This is where I had a melanoma taken off. I mean, it amazed me every day that you would have these kind of encounters. It wasn't every day, but it was most days. I would have remarkable conversations because I I invited people to have a conversation with me.
You met some real characters along the way. Do you have any that were favorites? And have you kept in touch with anybody you met on your ride?
I have kept in touch with people. Now, I have to say, I have to give a shout out to the librarians along the way, because these little towns had they had maybe a tiny, very tenuous internet connection. So I remember stopping in the little bitty town of Walnut, Kansas, and well, the library's internet connection had gone down. So Elizabeth's best laid plans to do a journal entry was kaput. But lo and behold, there was a restaurant where I could go eat while I tried to figure out what to do next. Well, the librarian said, Elizabeth, we can help you out. We're going to call ahead to Girard, Kansas, and let the librarian there know that you're on your way. I said, wow. So I pedaled off to Girard, and there was a computer. Not only that, but the librarian there said, well, Elizabeth, where are you going to stay? I said, well, I'll figure something out. I saw that you don't allow camping at your municipal park, which I kind of counted on. She said, you're not going to stay in a park. You're staying with my family. One of my children is off at college. So I stayed, but she takes me to a place called Mom's Cafe, and I'm not making that up, in Girard, Kansas. And then, I mean, it was the connections that you made were just phenomenal. I mean, Kansas had to be the friendliest state on the whole ride. I think in one town it was raining. I had 3 offers to stay overnight with people. So it was that, and I thought, where am I? Who are these people who make eye contact with you and answer any questions, have a direct conversation? So that was delightful. And I could go on and on, because like I try to tell people, and I tried to write, the characters in this country are as varied as the landscape. You just have to be out there paying attention.
That's wonderful advice. So you also hiked the Appalachian Trail, all of it. What similarities and differences did you find between the 2 trips?
Well, that for me, the walking, I mean, carrying a backpack is we used to joke it's like the strong back, weak mind tour, because why would anybody put 40 pounds on their back, even though gear has gotten lighter? And I did the AT that had been a dream of mine. And I guess when you're diagnosed with cancer, you feel like your life is accelerated. I felt like I was on speed. I have to fit this, and I have to do that. I have to do that. So I made a decision in my late 20s to quit a newspaper job, which was probably, looking back, stupid. And people probably looked at me and thought, what are you doing? But having been diagnosed at melanoma at such a young age, seeing my father die, growing up with that, I thought that was my fate. I thought, I'm not going to make it beyond age 44. I have to fit things in. So I had undergone some pretty grueling chemotherapy. And when I got through that, it hadn't shrunk the tumors. They were still in my lungs. But I thought, I got to do this now. I cannot sit around and wait. And anybody who's dealt with a disease like this knows you want to get on with it. You don't know how much time you have. You don't know what the next turn's going to be. So I think that was 2,167 miles. I actually started out alone, met my husband on this hike. So that was different. But it was.
You didn't pick up another husband on the next ride, huh?
No, but it was.
It's great that you've kept the first one.
Exactly. But it's all about, reaching a destination they're probably on the trail, you're more isolated. The bicycling, you have access to towns, you make more mileage every day. So the AT is a little bit more of an internal journey. And it was for me, that was very important. I was trying to sort out, okay, what am I going to do with the time that I have left? And I don't know how much that is. So.
Great. What advice do you have for anybody that wants to make one of these mega trips like the two that you did?
I would say, I think it's so crucial to have a plan, but don't over plan. Because if you over plan, you're going to set yourself up for disappointment. And you have to be, I mean, look at our COVID world. Did we all have to turn around and figure everything out and say, wow, how do I do this? You have to be willing to be flexible. So yes, have a map. That's a good idea. But for Pete's sake, don't block out each day and say, I'm going to, say on a trail map, I'm going to do 25 miles and then I'm going to do 25. Don't try to do that, because you will make yourself insane. And what if you get a blister? What if something happens? You have to you keep your eye on the prize, so to speak, but you need to get up each day and take things as they come towards you. And it may sound like a cliche, but it's really necessary, because over planning will just squelch the joy of the adventure, because it's an adventure. So you need to be open to whatever comes your way.
That's great. So the book also delves into you trying to understand your late father, who passed away when you were just 15. As you say in the book, quote, "This pursuit would allow me to seek my own truths about my father, because I realized I couldn't ever know who I was if I didn't know him. What surprised me is how my journey also let me dig deeply into my grief over his death, deep sorrow I was hardly aware I had been lugging it around since high school." Elizabeth, your title includes the phrase "big C." You mentioned about how people didn't even mention the word cancer back when your father, his days. Things were more open when you were treated for cancer. And now, of course, we live in the era of oversharing. Can you reflect on that evolution and how discussing cancer can make a difference?
Yeah, I think it can make a difference. And like you said, there's a boundary between sharing and oversharing. And I like to think I erred on the side of sharing just enough. It was a matter of putting people at ease, but it was back in the 70s when my father died. I mean, we talked, we knew he died of cancer. I mean, we were at the hospital, all of that was going on, but it was the grief part too. I guess people thought, oh, kids are resilient, they'll be fine. And I didn't I didn't know anything else, just because of the kind of family I was raised in. It was more, chop wood, carry water. You got on with things, right? That's what you
Mhm.
did. So we got on with it. And then I realized, well, maybe I need to delve into this clear cancer connection that I ended up having, which my father would have been mortified if he had lived long enough to know that I was going through what he went through. And I can go into the part about, me understanding him. I don't know if you have another question on that you want to segue into.
Yeah, we'll get back to that. But can you talk about your health now, if you don't mind? And what do you want people most to understand about melanoma, the treatment of which has come a very long way?
Oh, it is astounding to me, the science and what has progressed in melanoma. I mean, my health is good. Am I grateful for dermatologists? Yes, I am.
Mhm.
Do I wear sunscreen? Yes. I'm not wearing any on the Zoom today, but I
Pretty
I'm
safe
very
indoors.
obedient. When doctors tell me something, I listen. So and I think that really matters. And
And not just people with a history of melanoma need to be wearing that sunscreen, but everybody.
exactly, because I mean, when I was a kid, we would go to the shore, the beach. I would just get roasted, and I know that was a contributing factor. Did we know better? Maybe a tiny bit of us did, but we
We
really,
used to put baby oil on to get
thank you.
tanner.
Right.
Yeah.
So
What a bad idea.
I mean, I have a light complexion, so it's not so surprising. But so my health is good. I've had a few, melanoma scares, but they've been skin situations that can be taken care of. I haven't had any more internal, and I mean that's 20 years. So yay for that.
That's wonderful. That's great. Um, you've published this book in the middle of a pandemic. Any lessons learned from your trip or from your journey through cancer that you think would help people during this public health challenge?
Oh, um, I like to think, I mean, I just when this pandemic came about, I thought, holy cow, Elizabeth, it took you all these years to publish this book. And now it comes out and we can't get outside and we can't do the normal things. But I like to think of myself, and this isn't all the time because we all have our moments when we think, why me? I like to think of myself as somebody who says, I'm going to find a way around. So that's what I have tried to do with this book. And it's about persisting. And you figure something is going to evolve here. Hope is not a strategy, right? You need to have, so thank goodness that we could do things digitally. But it sort of ties back to the advances with melanoma treatments, what we were talking about earlier.
Hmm.
Progress gets made, things will change. And so what you have in front of you one day is not forever. So I think that just like these melanoma treatments, I mean, when my father was undergoing them in the 50s, 60s, 70s, very barbaric. By the time I was treated, it was a little more advanced, more immunotherapies. Now I go to these conferences and I am astounded, just amazed at what is available to people. I mean, I'm sitting next to people who are diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma, and I think, how are you even here? So the treatments are so much better. And I guess, going through this pandemic, you have to deal every day, you have to deal with it. No whine, everyone's in the same boat. So no whining. We all have to move together. But you are hoping that progress will be made and that we can resume something. Do we want to go back to exactly what we were? I don't know. Everyone's going to have to revisit that themselves and make a decision. But uh, don't think that just because you're in a situation one day that you're stuck there forever, especially if you're willing to put the energy in to moving.
That's great. So let's talk about your father now. You present your father as really a multidimensional character, not just some fondly remembered ideal of perfection. You're unsparing in looking, for instance, at his eruptions of anger. In chapter 13, you say that after radiation therapy, quote, perhaps those beams, evidently unable to prevent the cancer cells from multiplying, had instead shut off the switch that controlled his anger. Had the fire and fury exited, diffusing the time bomb that usually ticks inside him, leaving him just too damn tired to shout anymore? Elizabeth, you described your family as undemonstrative. How do they feel about you writing this book?
Well, I think uh, I, my sisters have told me, I have 3 sisters, and they have told me they thought it was really brave putting something into words that they only had little snippets that they carried around. And I tried to gather all those snippets and weave it into a narrative. I mean, it's about storytelling, right? I'm supposed to be a reporter, a journalist, whatever you want to call me. So I like to think I can put words together. This was daunting putting these words together. I mean, when you think back, if we all think honestly back to age 15, what did we know about anything? Well, we thought we knew a lot, right?
I've
And
got
I
two 15-year-olds. I'm sure I know all about that.
and I just thought I had this image. I remember somebody saying to me when I was an adult, looking at me and say, "Oh, Elizabeth, your humor, your personality, you remind me so much of your father." And I didn't know any better. I thought it was an insult because my sisters tended to remember my father as he was explosive. He had a temper, and he was a very funny man. I mean, he was charming. He was a teacher, and students loved him. The parents loved him. I mean, he was a people magnet. So trying to take those memories, and my mother is still alive. I talked to her a lot about this, as well as some of my father's other friends and other relatives, trying to make sense. Who was this man? Why was he the way he was? You can never answer those kinds of questions 100%, but I wanted to do him justice in this book. I also didn't want the book to be just a travelogue. Oh, look, Elizabeth went here, Elizabeth went there. Oh, she had cancer treatments. Okay, that's lovely. That's good for my journal. But I wanted this to be a book that resonated on many different levels. And he was a key part of it. So when I look back and I think he enlisted in the Navy out of high school, was diagnosed with melanoma in his early 20s, and then he and my mother got married, and he was dogged by this disease throughout his adult life. And I think, okay, he was in the Korean War, he was on a Navy ship shooting at, I mean, the things that man went through. So as an adult, I could look at him and say, well, no wonder he had feelings. No wonder there was anger. Is it right? I don't know. Is it right to yell at your kids? That's a discussion for a psychiatric convention of some sort. But I just needed to make sense of it, and I felt like I sort of reconnected with him, and I rediscovered him. That's what this was about. I realized I have rediscovered this sort of caricature that I carried around and tried to present it as wholly as possible. And um, I figure it's a good thing when people call me and say, Elizabeth, I had to put down those chapters because I was crying. And I thought then I told you a story that means something. And then they picked it back up. So that was the whole point, to have it be so real that you felt like you knew this man and you were maybe in the room with him. That
Mhm.
was my goal.
And how did your mom feel about the book?
She she told me, and these were large words coming from my mother, Elizabeth, I am very proud of you for what you have accomplished, because I was not sharing these chapters regularly with my family. I mean, like I said, I joke, it took me a long time to write this book because it's really hard for reporters to interview themselves.
Hmm.
That is painful and excruciating. And I had to set it aside sometimes because I also, like I mentioned earlier, I don't want this to be a oversharing journal entry, something that should have been kept, in a drawer with my journal. I needed it to be, something close to literature, right? So, but yes, so my mother understood all of that, and I think she just really appreciated having the story all in one place, as much as I could tell all in one place, weaving these parts together. Because when I rode across the country, I mean, she was reading all my journal entries and rooting me on. So,
Oh.
and
How
so,
did she feel about it when you set off on the adventure, or when you told her you were going to do this crazy
well,
thing?
I mean, obviously I'm old enough to make my own decisions. I think she thought it was wonderful. Was she a little nervous? Maybe, but she never let me know that, because she, I guess she trusts my instincts. Maybe she trusts them more than I do sometimes. We're told to trust our instincts. It's when we don't that we get into trouble, right? So, no, she was very, very supportive, which was a nice surprise because I wasn't sure what reaction I was going to get.
Having lost a parent to cancer, what advice do you have for people going through cancer on how to share that information with their loved ones, especially children? And your description of learning your father's cancer had spread to his brain was really heartrending. I'll read a little bit of that. Quote, I felt as if I were on the high end of a seesaw and my playmate had just gotten up and walked away, leaving me desperate for breath and crashing back to earth. I knew this much from the science I'd had through ninth grade. The brain controls the lungs and heart. When those organs shut down, life ceases. You whirl away into that sinkhole of nothingness forever. There, clinging to that wretched chair, was when I grasped the cruel terror of the word never. Death meant I would never, ever, ever see my father again. Is there a better way, Elizabeth, to talk about terminal illness with children?
I I don't know if there's a better way. Like I said, that was that was a conversation from the 70s. And here my mother, was trying to raise four girls and going through this whole um, wrenching experience with my father. And at the time we were living in New England, and he was away a lot because he was in the hospital and she would go visit. So I think it was so hard for her to have a conversation with her children about this. We knew the big picture, but we did not know all the details. So I found out, and maybe this was my early reporter instincts, I had to ask questions if I wanted to know. So I made myself ask those questions, and it was hard. And so, yes, indeed, there is a gentler way. And I think that we keep trying to grow as a society. Are we ever going to be perfect? We're not, on many different levels. But I think all of these experiences, if my sisters had to have those conversations with their children, they would be totally different conversations. I think that people growing up, they either follow the pattern or they react and do things differently. So yes, there are better ways. There are also, there's access to therapy for people, and there are more safety nets and helplines available than there were then. And so I mean, is it ever easy? No, it isn't easy, but it can be less hard.
Okay. It took you 20 years from dipping your tires in the Atlantic at the end of your journey to publishing the book. Why so long? And at what point did you realize you might have a book out of this ride? And did you start with that in mind, or did that idea come later?
Well, I did not start with it in mind. I thought that doing the journal entries along the way was quite an accomplishment when I was counting on libraries and, people's personal computers and colleges, wherever I could stop.
Yeah, it's not
So
like you could Instagram it right
yeah,
from a phone.
exactly. There was no texting of no, none of that. I mean, I was even, mailing in canisters of film back to the library, back to the hospital, and they would develop them. So the book idea was, several people had suggested it. I started it. I set it aside. I don't know how to write a book. I guess I could have asked somebody, how do I do this? But me being, stubborn sometimes, I'm like, I'll figure this out. I'll keep trying to figure this out. Well, I have to say, just to go back to that Pulitzer, I think that winning that Pulitzer, because that was such a deep dive into that whole oil spill up in Michigan, we produced, I mean, here we were, this tiny little startup, right? And we produced this remarkable work that, that was judged to be above what the Washington Post and the Boston Globe had turned in that year. So that was validation. And I think that is when I realized, oh, wait a minute, I can use that skill set and take these disparate pieces and make this book work. I can do it. So that really helped me. Just, it was a boost of confidence to be able to say, if I can do that, I think I ought to be able to do this. So then I really devoted time. I made a point of taking time away from so much reporting and trying to dedicate, because for people who write all day, it's like anything. You do one thing all day, sometimes you want to do something different. I don't mind.
Go out and ride a bike.
Exactly. So that was a big boost. And then when I started to, I'd send out little pieces and have people read chapters. And it wasn't just, I mean, of course, your mother's not going to say, oh, you need to edit that. But when I had real editors looking at it and saying, "Whoa, you've got something here," that's that was another piece of validation. But yeah, I mean, I kind of joke about it taking so long. I'm like, good God, could that woman ever hit a deadline when she was working at newspapers? Well, yeah, I did all the time. But this one, like I said earlier, interviewing yourself about these intimate things, you're exposing yourself. And, being vulnerable on the bike trip was one thing, but putting it in print and letting other people read it, that kind of scared me.
Yeah. If anyone is just tuning in, by the way, we're chatting with Elizabeth McGowan about her book, Outpedaling the Big C. The National Press Club members can receive 10% off the book price when they buy it through our friends at Politics and Prose. For more information, you can check press.org. So you just mentioned the Pulitzer Prize for your stories on the Kalamazoo oil spill. Environmentalism seems to be a theme in your life, from your childhood camping trips, and I was fortunate enough to have many of those as well as a kid, to your Pulitzer Prize on the spill, to your appreciation that really comes through in the book for the beauty that was all around you on your bike ride. You say in chapter 12, quote, "My head, of course, understands the potential economic and clean energy benefits of hydropower, but my heart believes rivers were meant to roll unharnessed, so fish and other aquatic creatures can feed, breed, and freely follow other natural cycles of their watery worlds." What suggestions, Elizabeth, do you have for parents to instill in their children that love of the outdoors and care for the environment?
Wow, I'd say, I mean, if this COVID has taught us anything, it's get outside and appreciate it.
Mhm.
And it doesn't have to be, I mean, yes, of course, we can go to all the iconic parks, but it can be, you can go to your local, state campground and expose. It doesn't have to be an overseas trip or some
Mhm.
large, expensive investment. It can be something simple, spending time in the backyard. I mean, teaching kids that brood X is not something that we should be scared of, that it's something, teach kids that it's part of the food chain. I mean, you can start with the tiniest thing. I mean, I have a front yard. I live in Washington. I have a front yard that Don, my husband, and I have converted to all native species, right? Because we appreciate that. It brings a lot of pollinators. The neighbors weren't quite sure about that, but I'll tell you, the kids who walk by, they get so engaged when you show them a flower, a plant, a bee, insects. It's those small conversations that you can have with people that lead to something bigger. And there's so many, you can't force this on people, and you don't want to do that. You want to invite them to something that they feel comfortable with. So, but I just think, um, I guess I chose to focus on environmental issues, and I realized I have to focus on energy issues, because if we don't solve those, we're not going to have an environment. So that's why I've tried to balance. But I just think exposing your children, walking outside, breathing the air, is just, being in parks, whatever you have access to, take advantage of it and hope that they ask for more.
As far as your work, the media is coming under a lot of fire in recent years of being biased, these kinds of things. You
Mhm.
clearly are an environmentalist. How do you balance that with being fair in the writing that you do on the environment and on energy?
Yeah, I guess I would say I'm more of an ecologist, that
Mm.
I a conservationist, that I appreciate. I can understand what the big picture is, and I can understand why why it matters that we, keep our environment clean. That doesn't mean I'm not going to write stories. I don't write advocacy stories. It just, by having an understanding of these issues, it allows me to do a deeper dive than, maybe a daily paper might frame something, but they can't go into as much depth. And I like to think that I've accumulated sources and knowledge, which allows me to do a deeper dive. So I kind of cringe when people, say, oh, you're an
Green.
environmentalist. Well, I think I just have a deep appreciation and an understanding. And unlike the book where I had to include Elizabeth, Elizabeth is not included in the news stories. They are, the traditional. I always think about, Judy Woodruff in a recent interview when somebody asked her about her journalism, and she said, well, nobody really gives a damn what Judy Woodruff thinks. They want to know what the news is. So I keep that in mind, from journalism school, as well as from just like you said, how things are framed and all the accusations that fly these days. I really need to have a barrier on that front.
Okay. So we have a question from one of our listeners who says, Elizabeth, you are amazing. You continue your outreach and support for cancer research as well as cycling in your role as co-chair of the District of Columbia Recreational Trails Advisory Committee. How does your work today as a reporter and as a public servant volunteer coalesce?
Oh, I just think it's I can serve on this committee because I'm not writing about it. So that is, something that's allowed as far as our the ethical code of journalists. And I just think that it's a small part that I can do because I'm sort of a filter. I live up in Ward 5, and we're trying to make the city more accessible to everybody. And COVID taught us the popularity of bicycling, right? And so I figured, well, that's a contribution I can make, reviewing applications for improving trails, expanding trails, whether they're hiking trails or bicycling trails, whatever they are. And that's a role I can play. It seems like a natural segue. So I do a lot of volunteer work at Rock Creek Park, building trails, removing invasive species, because it's something I can do in my backyard, and I can educate myself and other people. So
Great. What's your favorite personal bike ride around here, around
oh,
Washington?
there are so many of them, but I have to say one of the most remarkable ones is when Don and I took a vacation, got on our bikes up here in Northeast DC, rode down to Georgetown, got on the C&O Canal Path, and went all the way up there, picked up the Great Allegheny Passage, and went to Pittsburgh, never having to get off
Wow.
the bike. Stayed
Wow.
overnight, visited Pittsburgh, and then we rode back, carrying our own
Wow.
gear and camping. That's remarkable that I can do that from my doorstep.
Yeah, and especially in a pretty busy urban area.
Exactly, but there
This
are
is
so
not
many.
Kansas.
Exactly. I mean, there's so many trails around here that we really, it is an embarrassment of riches. And so anybody who is, moving that way around here, it always rates really high. I mean, I don't know that anybody ever beats Portland, Oregon, but Washington, D.C.
Mhm.
holds its own.
That's great. So you've accomplished more bucket list type items in less than six decades than most people ever do. You say that after your dad's death, as you mentioned, you were spurred by the fact you didn't know how long you had to live. What can you say to the rest of us to get us off our couches and out doing the things our hearts really desire?
Yeah, it's risky, and I think it's harder when you don't have something, with this melanoma. I always felt like it was in the rearview mirror, or I would turn around and there it would be, with its big claws ready to dig
Mhm.
in. So, and maybe that was also youth, but I would say listen to yourself. I mean, and I'm not going to advise, someone who's trying to raise 3 or 4 children to leave their spouse and take off, but have that
Yeah, don't tell my spouse to do that, please.
but have that conversation, talk about it, because people bury things. And I think it's sort of like when we were talking earlier about cancer. Just have the conversation. It's hard, and sometimes it's very difficult to bring it up, but be the one that says, I'd really like to do that. And then you can set goals, because I think there's nothing worse than not following through on those dreams that you have. I think it just leads to smoldering, and then people
Mm,
become somebody they don't want to be because they feel like they're trapped somewhere and they can't get out of it. So, but there are people willing to listen and people willing to help, and you can't come up with all the ideas yourself. That's the joy of other humans. Talk to them. How did you arrange that? How, get those pieces and start putting them together, because otherwise, if you say never, you won't do it. So be brave and don't be afraid to take a risk.
that's great. So, what's your next big adventure?
Oh, well, I know, we've all been kind of hibernating and I have ridden my bike a lot around here. I'm trying to, follow all the right rules, but, and my people might laugh at this, but I do, Don and I want to go out and ride across Ohio. So you can go from Cleveland to Cincinnati, and we'll probably go back because we're, obsessed with end to end things. But I have a lot of relatives there, and I think it would be fun to have a reunion with my 80-something-year-old aunt, my mom's sister, and cousins, and other people who've been very supportive of this whole book. And I think that's what I'm shooting for. And I kind of made those plans when we were halfway out of hibernation, and now things have opened up so much. It's like now the choices are almost overwhelming. So, but that's the next thing, and then who knows what follows that.
That's great. So, in the book, you mentioned that you and your dad really bonded over baseball. And I think I recall you saying you and Don, when you first met, would talk baseball.
Mhm.
Do you still keep in touch? Is it the Nationals, or you got the Red Sox on your cheering list? Or what's your favorite sports memory?
Oh, I think that I mean, the Red Sox will always be, near and dear to my heart, right? And
I've got my Cubs.
okay. And I follow the Orioles because they're the American League team around here, and I follow the Nats because they're the hometown team, and this Washington was starved of baseball for so long, and so it's joyous to have it back. And I have to say that one of my favorite memories, and the reason I even brought up the baseball, was the 1975 World Series. And if there are any Boston fans I apologize for bringing this up, but they lost to the Reds. But my father and I got to watch some of those games and together, and so I will always remember that, because here it was a little tiny black and white television, but it was 1975, and then the next year he wasn't there, so that has a special pull on me.
I can relate. I can remember at 1 in the morning when the Cubs won the World Series in extra innings,
Mhm.
calling my dad at 1 in the morning, who was screaming at the top of his lungs. He was so excited. So,
Exactly, just like the classic when Carlton Fisk is willing his home run to go to the correct side of the foul pole at Fenway Park. I mean, that's an image that will live forever. So
great. That's wonderful. And any final advice you have for your fellow journalists about how to take their own lives and turn them into a book when there's something there?
wow. I mean, there are so many books that come out every year now. That's
Mhm.
what I was like. Why do I want to add one more to this huge collection? Who's going to have time to read all this? But it sort of follows, the adventure. I mean, there are probably some books out there that maybe shouldn't have been written, but yours might be the one that should have been written. So now that I know more about the process, I would I would join some kind of a group and vet the idea with people. I mean, I was kind of burrowed in and doing this on my own, and I would periodically mention it to people, but I didn't have a lot of conversations about it because I was kind of mortified that I was undertaking this book. It just seemed so daunting. So if you are dedicated to it, and the publishing world is so different now, so you need to learn the terminology. It's like learning a new language. So whether you get involved, through the press club, through the writers center, someplace, immerse yourself in this so that you know what you're getting into, because
Great.
you're just finding a publisher is, it's all this new language, and finding an agent, all of these things, it's like drinking from the fire hose, and it's too much, so you need, ask for help.
All right. Well, it certainly worked for you. So, before I ask the final question, let me take a moment first to thank the organizers of today's event: headliners, co team leaders Donna Linewand and Lori Russo, today's headliner event coordinator extraordinaire Heather Forsgren Weaver, club communications director Lindsay Underwood, and club executive director Bill McCarran. I would also like to tell you about an upcoming NPC headliner. On June 3rd, we'll hear from Jake Tapper, CNN anchor and chief Washington correspondent, who will discuss his book, The Devil May Dance, a novel. Finally, it is my honor and privilege to virtually present you with the famous National Press Club mug. Elizabeth, you can pick yours up at the club at your convenience. Now, for our last question. If your book were made into a movie, who would play you, and who else would you like to see in the cast?
Well, I would go with someone like Frances McDormand. I don't know if she would be, the right fit, but everything that she's in is remarkable to me. So that that would be my choice. As far as um, other, like I said earlier, I'm not much of a movie person. I would love this to be a call, because it would be like a call for authenticity, right? Go to each of these states and find these characters. Now, some of them aren't with us anymore, and obviously that would be a ridiculous undertaking, but that would be the best way, just to capture the essence of these people who I met. I mean, going to that, I should have mentioned this, but pedaling through the Ozarks, which was like the roller coaster ride, and stopping, there was no place to camp. So I stopped at a bar and asked if I could, you know, pitch my tent on something the size of a dining room table. And they said, sure, that's good. That's fine. So then I went inside, and, it was a Monday or Tuesday night, and it was like the Cheers of the Ozarks, right? So I'm learning how to dance the two-step. The woman next to me, well, they weren't serving any food that night. So I thought, okay, well, they've got Slim Jims. I can eat some of those, and whatever I can, roust up in my pannier. The woman next to me, she's like, oh, I'm the chef, but usually I have Mondays off. So she went back in the kitchen and put together these tortillas and some other things for me. So it was just a constant, those were the kind of experiences. And obviously, if you read the book, you'll see them, but those are the kind of people. And I don't know who you can get to play those roles besides those people.
Sounds like it'll be a great movie. Well, thank you to everybody who came along for the ride today. Thank you to Elizabeth, and good afternoon.
Thank you very much.